The wine glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone understood why. Duke Alaric Vane had not meant to say it aloud. The words had lived inside him for months, guarded and folded away, but wine and frustration had loosened his tongue, and now they hung in the air of the dining room like smoke that would not clear. "I am in love with your sister," he said, looking straight at Margaret Ashworth. "I have been for some time. I cannot pretend otherwise any longer." The table went silent. Forks stopped mid-air. A footman near the sideboard froze with a serving dish in his hands, unsure whether to step forward or vanish into the wall behind him. Margaret set down her own glass with careful precision, as though the smallest sound might break something more fragile than crystal. Across the table, her younger sister Clara turned a delicate shade of pink, her lashes lowering, her lips curving into the smallest, most practiced smile. Lady Beaumont, their aunt, pressed a hand to her chest as if she might faint from delight. "Well," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained triumph. "Well, this is news indeed." It was not news to Margaret. She had known for 4 months. She kept her face still, the way she had trained herself to do since childhood, the way a woman raised in a house full of watching eyes learns to do without ever being taught in words. She lifted her chin and reached for her water glass, and if her hand trembled, no one at the table seemed to notice, because every eye in the room had turned to Clara. "Your Grace," Clara said softly, "you flatter me." "It is not flattery," Alaric said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that made the words land harder than he perhaps intended. "I have watched you across every ballroom this season. I have thought of little else." Margaret studied her plate. The roasted pheasant had gone cold, though she could not recall when. She thought of the afternoon in early spring when she had walked past the library door, left open only a crack, and heard Alaric's voice speaking to his closest friend, low and urgent, saying almost the very words he had just spoken at this table. She had stood frozen in the corridor, one hand against the wall, and she had not moved until the voices inside had changed subject. She had never told a soul. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself that whatever she felt when she heard his voice catch on her sister's name was nothing worth naming, nothing worth examining too closely, because Clara was the beauty of the family, the one men noticed first and remembered longest, and Margaret had long ago made peace with being the sister who managed the household accounts and remembered everyone's birthdays and stood quietly at the edge of every gathering. Peace, she was discovering tonight, was a poor word for what she had actually done. She had simply buried the feeling, and hoped the burial would hold. "Alaric," said her father, Baron Ashworth, clearing his throat with the particular gruffness of a man caught entirely by surprise. "This is rather sudden for the dinner table, is it not?" "Forgive me," Alaric said, though he did not look as though he regretted it. "I have held my tongue long enough. I did not wish to hold it any longer." Lady Beaumont was already calculating. Margaret could see it in the quick, bright movement of her aunt's eyes, already imagining the wedding, the connections it would bring, the standing it would grant the family. "We must not rush the poor man," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "But surely, we may allow a proper courtship to begin." Clara's eyes flicked, just once, toward Margaret. It was brief, barely a heartbeat, but Margaret caught it, and something in that glance unsettled her more than the announcement itself. There was a question in it, not surprise. A question, as if Clara were asking whether Margaret had known, whether Margaret had kept something from her. Margaret held her sister's gaze and gave nothing away. She had become very good at giving nothing away. "I think," Margaret said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, "that congratulations are perhaps a little early, but I am glad for you, Clara." The words tasted strange in her mouth. Not quite a lie, not quite the truth either. Clara's smile widened, though something behind her eyes did not match it. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "You always know the right thing to say." Alaric's gaze moved from Clara to Margaret, and lingered there a moment longer than politeness required. Margaret felt it like a hand pressed briefly against her skin, and she looked down at her plate to escape it. Across the room, near the window, sat Nathaniel Gray, a family friend, who had ridden over that evening at Lady Beaumont's invitation, and now clearly wished he had not. He had said little through dinner, watching the scene unfold with the careful attention of a man who noticed far more than he ever spoke aloud. His eyes, too, found Margaret, and unlike Alaric's, his gaze held no confusion, only a quiet, steady concern, as if he alone in the room understood that something painful had just happened to her, even if no one else could name what it was. The rest of the meal passed in a strange, brittle politeness. Lady Beaumont filled the silences with talk of the coming season, of balls and invitations and which families would need to be informed of this development, as though the development were already a settled fact rather than a single sentence spoken too quickly over wine. Baron Ashworth asked Alaric careful questions about his intentions, his estate, his standing, the practical matters a father must ask when a duke declares himself at the dinner table. Clara answered every question directed her way with grace, her cheeks still faintly flushed, her manner exactly what was expected of a young woman who had just been chosen. Margaret said little. She ate what she could. She answered when spoken to. And beneath the table, her hands remained folded tightly in her lap, holding themselves together the way the rest of her could not quite manage. When the meal finally ended and the family rose to move to the drawing room, Margaret found a moment to slip away, murmuring something about a shawl she had left in her chamber. No one questioned it. No one ever questioned Margaret's quiet departures, because she was the sister who managed things, who kept the household running smoothly, who could be trusted to see to small tasks without drawing attention. She did not go to her chamber. She went instead to the narrow servants' stair at the end of the east corridor, the one she had used as a girl to escape difficult evenings, and she climbed it slowly until she reached the small window seat at the top, the one that overlooked the garden below. She sat there in the dark, her knees drawn up, and allowed herself, for the first time that night, to breathe. 4 months. She had carried this knowledge for 4 months, had watched Alaric at balls and dinners and afternoon calls, had listened to him speak of ordinary things while knowing what lived beneath his words, and she had told herself it changed nothing, that knowing a secret was not the same as being part of it. Tonight had proven her wrong. Tonight, the secret had walked out into the open and taken a seat at the table, and it had brought with it every feeling Margaret had spent months trying to bury. She heard footsteps on the stair below and stiffened, expecting a servant, but the tread was too heavy, too deliberate. She rose quickly, smoothing her skirts, ready to explain herself, and found Nathaniel standing at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. "You did not," she lied. "Margaret," he said her name gently, the way one might approach a spooked horse. "You left rather suddenly." "I forgot my shawl," she said, gesturing vaguely, though her arms were bare and the excuse was thin. Nathaniel did not point this out. He simply looked at her, his expression patient, and something about that patience made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You do not have to pretend with me," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Margaret opened her mouth to deny it, to insist that she was perfectly well, that the evening had been a pleasant surprise and nothing more, but the words would not come. Instead, to her own horror, she felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall. "I am glad for my sister," she said instead, her voice thin. "I did not ask if you were glad," Nathaniel said. "I asked if you were well." She had no answer for that. She stood at the top of the narrow stair, the darkness of the garden pressing against the window at her back, and for the first time in 4 months, she allowed herself to wonder what might have happened if she had spoken the truth the moment she overheard it in the library that spring afternoon, instead of folding it away and telling herself it did not matter. It mattered now. It had always mattered. She simply had not been brave enough, or perhaps not foolish enough, to say so. Below them, faintly, she could hear Lady Beaumont's voice drifting up from the drawing room, already speaking of wedding dates, and Clara's soft laughter answering her, bright and easy, the laughter of a woman whose future had just been decided in the most flattering way possible. Margaret pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window and said nothing at all. Nathaniel climbed 2 more steps, close enough now that she could see the concern etched plainly into his face, a concern he had never bothered to hide from her even when the rest of the world required masks. "You have always carried too much alone," he said. "Since we were children you have done it. You think no one notices, but I have noticed for years." "There is nothing to carry," she said, though her voice betrayed her, thin and unsteady. "My sister has been chosen by a duke. It is a happy thing for this family. Is it happy for you?" The question landed with more weight than she was prepared for, and she looked away from him, back toward the dark garden where the hedges stood in neat black rows under a sliver of moon. She thought of all the evenings she had spent arranging flowers for Clara's suitors, mending the hems of Clara's gowns before balls, standing at the edge of rooms while her sister danced beneath candlelight, and she had told herself, every single time, that she did not mind, that her place was simply a different one, quieter, steadier, less admired but no less necessary. She had believed it, mostly, until tonight, when the one secret she had never spoken aloud had been spoken by someone else entirely, in front of everyone, without a single thought for what it might cost her. "I should return downstairs," she said finally, stepping past him on the narrow stair, "before I am missed. Margaret." She paused, one hand on the banister, and did not turn around. "Whatever happens," Nathaniel said quietly, "you are not required to smile through all of it. Not with me." She did not answer him. She could not without saying more than she was ready to say, not without unraveling something she had spent 4 long months keeping carefully knotted. Instead, she continued down the stairs, back toward the warm light and easy laughter of the drawing room, back toward the sister who did not yet know what her elder sister had been hiding, and the Duke who had no idea he had spoken his heart to the wrong woman first, months ago, in a library he had thought was empty. The evening would end, as evenings always did, with polite farewells and promises to call again soon. But Margaret knew, as she smoothed her skirts and arranged her face into something calm and pleasant, that nothing about this house would feel quite the same again. 4 months earlier, Margaret had not gone looking for the truth. It had found her, uninvited, on an ordinary afternoon in early spring. She had been carrying a stack of correspondence to her father's study, her mind occupied with nothing more pressing than a torn hem and a letter from a cousin in Bath, when she passed the library door and heard her own family's name spoken in a voice she recognized instantly. Duke Alaric Vane's voice, low and urgent, speaking to his closest friend, a young officer named Edmund Whitmore who had been visiting the estate that week. She should have walked on. She told herself this many times in the months that followed, that a better woman, a more disciplined woman, would have continued down the corridor without breaking stride. Instead, she stopped, one hand pressed flat against the cool plaster wall, and she listened. "I cannot stop thinking of her," Alaric had said. "I have tried, Edmund. I have tried to think of a dozen other women this season, and every one of them fades beside her." "Then tell her," Edmund had answered, amused. "You are a duke. You need not suffer in silence like some lovesick poet. It is not so simple. Her family will expect a formal courtship, a proper announcement. I do not wish to rush it and frighten her, or worse, frighten her family into some hasty arrangement that feels more like a transaction than a courtship." Who is she, then, this paragon who has silenced the great Duke Vane? There had been a pause, and Margaret remembered holding her breath in the corridor, her heart beating so loudly she feared it might be heard through the door. "Ashworth," Alaric had said, "the younger daughter." The words had landed in Margaret's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her that took a long moment to settle. Clara. Of course it was Clara. It was always Clara, in every ballroom, every drawing room, every gathering where the two sisters stood together, and every eye in the room found its way, eventually, to the younger, prettier, more effortlessly charming Ashworth daughter. Margaret had not been surprised. That was the strange, uncomfortable truth she had carried with her ever since. She had not been surprised at all, and yet something in her had still cracked quietly down the middle, some small and foolish hope she had not even realized she was nursing, extinguished in an instant by 2 words spoken through a library door. She had continued down the corridor that day, delivered her father's correspondence, and said nothing to anyone, not to her father, not to Clara, not even to Nathaniel, who might have understood better than anyone why the words had struck her the way they had. In the months since, Margaret had watched the courtship unfold in slow, careful stages, exactly as Alaric had described that afternoon in the library. He called at the house with increasing frequency, always with some polite pretext, a book he thought Clara might enjoy, an invitation to a concert, a question about the garden that somehow required an hour of conversation to answer. Clara received him warmly but without any particular urgency, the way a young woman receives attention she has come to expect as her due, admired but never quite astonished by it. Margaret, meanwhile, had made herself useful in the ways she always did. She arranged the tea when Alaric called. She excused herself at precisely the right moments to allow Clara and their guest a measure of privacy without appearing improper. She listened to Lady Beaumont's endless speculation about the match with a patient, agreeable expression, and she never once let slip that she had known the truth of it long before her aunt had begun her calculations. It was not easy. There were evenings when Alaric's gaze would land on her by accident, some passing remark exchanged while Clara was occupied elsewhere, and Margaret would feel the strange, unwelcome flicker of something she refused to name, something that had no business existing given what she knew of his heart. She told herself repeatedly that it was foolishness, that a woman did not develop feelings for a man simply because she had overheard him confess feelings for someone else, that such a thing made no sense and served no purpose beyond her own suffering. And yet it had happened all the same, slowly, without her permission, the way frost creeps across a window overnight, invisible until the morning reveals it fully formed. She thought sometimes of confiding in Clara, of simply telling her sister what she had overheard months before Alaric had ever formally approached the family, if only to relieve herself of the burden of carrying it alone. But each time she considered it, she found a reason to hold her tongue. Clara was happy, or seemed happy, flattered by the attention of a duke, and Margaret could not see what good it would do to complicate that happiness with the confession that her elder sister had known the truth for months and said nothing. There was also, if she was honest with herself, a quieter and less generous reason for her silence. A part of her, small and ashamed, did not wish to hand her sister the satisfaction of knowing that Margaret had overheard Alaric's confession and kept it to herself out of something that felt uncomfortably close to jealousy. It was not a thought she was proud of. It was not a thought she examined too closely, for fear of what she might find if she did. Nathaniel Gray had noticed the change in her before anyone else. He had known Margaret since childhood, their families neighboring estates that had exchanged visits and holidays for as long as either of them could remember, and he possessed an unfortunate talent for seeing past the careful composure Margaret presented to the rest of the world. He had asked her once, gently, over tea in the garden, whether something troubled her, and she had deflected the question so smoothly that even she had almost believed her own performance. But performances, she was learning, could only be sustained for so long. Lady Beaumont, for her part, had grown increasingly convinced that a formal match between Alaric and Clara was inevitable, and she had begun making preparations accordingly, dropping hints to acquaintances at church, mentioning the Duke's frequent visits to anyone who would listen, laying the groundwork for an announcement she seemed certain would come before summer's end. Baron Ashworth, more cautious by nature, had said little, though Margaret suspected he too had begun to see the shape of things to come. It was in this atmosphere, thick with expectation and unspoken currents, that the dinner had finally arrived, the one where Alaric's careful restraint had finally given way to whine and impatience, and the secret Margaret had guarded for 4 months had been spoken aloud by the very man who had first confessed it, in front of the entire family, without the faintest idea that his listener already knew every word before he said it. Now, lying awake in her chamber long after the house had gone quiet, Margaret stared at the canopy above her bed and turned the evening over in her mind, Clara's questioning glance across the table, Alaric's gaze lingering a moment too long, Nathaniel's quiet words on the stair, the ones that had nearly undone her composure entirely. She thought of the 4 months behind her and the uncertain stretch of months ahead, in which she would be expected to smile through a courtship she had known was coming before anyone else in the house, to help plan a wedding for a man she had somehow, foolishly, impossibly, come to care for herself. She did not know, lying there in the dark, whether she had the strength to do it. She only knew that the household expected her to try, and Margaret Ashworth had never once, in all her life, failed to do what was expected of her. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, it brought with it dreams of library doors left open a crack, and voices she could not quite outrun. The following morning, Margaret rose early, as she always did, and found Clara already awake in the breakfast room, sitting alone at the long table with a cup of chocolate cooling untouched before her. It was unusual to see her sister awake at such an hour, and unusual too to see her so still, her fingers turning the handle of the cup back and forth without lifting it. "You are up early," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her. "I could not sleep," Clara admitted. "I kept thinking of last night." Margaret busied herself with the teapot, keeping her hands occupied so they would not betray her. It is not every day a duke declares himself at dinner. I imagine it would keep anyone awake. "Do you think he means it?" Clara asked, and there was something in her voice that surprised Margaret, an uncertainty she had not expected from her sister, who had always seemed so assured of her own charms. "He has called on us for weeks now, and he has always been pleasant, attentive even, but I never once thought he intended to speak so plainly, and certainly not before the whole family. He seemed sincere," Margaret said carefully. "Sincere?" Clara turned the word over as though testing its weight. "Aunt Beaumont is already planning the wedding. Did you hear her last night? She spoke of dates as though the matter were entirely settled, as though I had not even been consulted. You have not given your answer yet, then?" "He has not formally asked," Clara said. "He only announced his feelings, which is not quite the same thing as a proposal, though everyone in this house seems determined to treat it as one." She looked up, and for a moment something vulnerable passed across her face, something Margaret rarely saw beneath her sister's usual composure. "What would you do, Margaret, if you were me?" The question caught Margaret entirely unprepared. She reached for her tea to give her hands something to do and her voice something to hide behind. I do not think my opinion signifies a great deal in a matter such as this. It signifies to me, Clara said. You always see things more clearly than I do. You always have. For one long, dangerous moment, Margaret considered telling her everything. The library door left open a crack, the voice she had recognized instantly. The 4 months of silence she had carried since, watching a courtship unfold that she had known was coming before anyone else in the family had even suspected it. The words rose in her throat, ready to be spoken, and she opened her mouth, uncertain even now what she meant to say. But the moment passed, as such moments often do, interrupted by the sound of Lady Beaumont's brisk footsteps in the corridor outside, and by the time their aunt swept into the breakfast room already speaking of invitation lists and appropriate dates for a formal call, the opportunity had closed itself, quietly and completely, and Margaret found she was almost relieved. There you both are, Lady Beaumont said, settling herself at the head of the table with the satisfaction of a general surveying a battlefield already half won. Clara, my dear, you must wear the blue silk when His Grace calls again. It suits your complexion beautifully, and blue has always been a fortunate color for declarations of this kind, or so my own mother used to say. He has not called to declare anything further, Aunt, Clara said. He has only spoken his feelings. There is a difference. A difference of perhaps a fortnight, if that, Lady Beaumont replied, waving a hand as though the distinction were beneath her notice. A man does not announce himself at a family dinner, in front of the girl's father, without full intention of following through. Mark my words, he will call within the week, and this time he will not leave without an understanding between them. Margaret watched her sister's face carefully as their aunt spoke, searching for some sign of what Clara truly felt beneath the polite attention she offered Lady Beaumont's every word. It was difficult to say. Clara had always been skilled at presenting exactly the face a room required of her, a skill Margaret recognized because she possessed a version of it herself, though theirs were built from very different materials. Baron Ashworth joined them a short while later, looking somewhat more rested than he had appeared the previous evening, though a certain wariness remained in the set of his shoulders. He spoke to Clara briefly about the seriousness of the matter, reminding her gently that whatever her aunt's enthusiasm, the final decision would rest with Clara herself, and that no daughter of his would be pressed into an arrangement she did not wholly desire, duke or no duke. It was, Margaret thought, a kinder speech than she had expected from her father, and she found herself grateful for it on her sister's behalf, even as a small, treacherous part of her wondered what it might feel like to have such consideration extended toward her own wishes, whatever those wishes might turn out to be. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Alaric called twice more within the week, exactly as Lady Beaumont had predicted, each visit conducted with scrupulous propriety, Margaret present in the room as chaperone while Clara and the Duke exchanged careful conversation about music and poetry and the coming summer season. Margaret said little during these visits, offering tea and the occasional polite remark, and if her attention occasionally strayed to the sound of Alaric's voice, to the particular way he laughed at something Clara said, she told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that such observations were simply the natural consequence of sitting in a room with two people for an hour at a time. It was during the second of these visits that Nathaniel arrived unannounced, ostensibly to discuss a matter of business with Baron Ashworth, though Margaret suspected, from the careful way his eyes found her the moment he entered the drawing room, that his errand had less to do with business than with checking on her welfare. He stayed only briefly, exchanging polite words with Alaric and Clara before excusing himself to speak with her father. But before he left the room entirely, he paused beside Margaret's chair and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You look tired," he said simply. "I am well," she answered, the same practiced lie she had offered him on the stairs days before. "You keep saying that," Nathaniel said, "and I keep not believing you." He left before she could construct a suitable reply, and Margaret sat through the remainder of the visit with his words turning quietly in her mind, unsettling her composure in ways she did not examine too closely, not that afternoon, and not for many afternoons after. By the time the roses in the garden had fully bloomed, the courtship between Duke Alaric Vane and Clara Ashworth had become the settled talk of every drawing room within a day's ride of the estate. Invitations arrived with increasing frequency, most of them addressed to the whole family but understood by everyone, without needing to be said aloud, as opportunities for Alaric and Clara to be seen together in public, to be watched and admired and discussed by the wider circle of society that had already begun treating the match as a foregone conclusion. Margaret found herself present at nearly every one of these occasions, not as a participant so much as an instrument, arranging seating so that Alaric and Clara might sit near one another, steering conversation away from awkward silences, managing the small, constant labor that a courtship required behind its polished surface. She had done this sort of work before, for other families, other daughters, but she had never done it while feeling quite so much like she was managing her own slow undoing. It was at a garden party hosted by the Whitmore family, Edmund's people, that Margaret first understood how deeply the situation had begun to affect her composure. The afternoon was warm, the lawn dotted with small groups of guests beneath colorful awnings, and Margaret had positioned herself near a table of refreshments, ostensibly overseeing the arrangement of cups and saucers, though in truth she was watching Alaric across the lawn, watching the easy, practiced way he bent his head toward Clara as they walked together along the edge of the rose beds. "You are staring," said a voice beside her. She startled, and turned to find Nathaniel standing at her elbow, a cup of lemonade in each hand, one of which he offered to her without waiting for her to ask. "I am not staring," she said, accepting the cup more out of reflex than desire. "I am ensuring the refreshments are adequate." "The refreshments," Nathaniel said dryly, "have been adequate for the last quarter of an hour. You have simply been standing here, watching them walk." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away, back toward the lawn, though she made a deliberate effort now not to let her gaze follow Alaric's figure. "It is my responsibility to see that the afternoon goes smoothly." "It is," Nathaniel agreed. "It is not, however, your responsibility to torture yourself in the process." She did not answer him. There was nothing she could say that would not reveal more than she intended, and so she sipped her lemonade and said nothing at all, and Nathaniel, to his credit, did not press her further, though he remained at her side for the rest of the afternoon, a quiet, steady presence that she found herself, against her better judgment, grateful for. It was later that same week, during a formal call at the Ashworth estate, that the first true crack appeared in the careful arrangement Margaret had maintained for months. Alaric had arrived in the late afternoon, as had become his custom, and Margaret had taken her usual seat near the window with a piece of needlework she rarely touched, present in the room as propriety required but attempting, as always, to make herself as unobtrusive as possible while Clara and the Duke conversed. The conversation had turned, as it often did, to matters of family and history, and Alaric had begun speaking of his childhood, of a summer spent at his family's coastal estate, of a dog he had loved as a boy and lost too young. "You have a gift for storytelling, Your Grace," Clara said, smiling. "You ought to write your memoirs someday." "Perhaps I shall, when I am old and have nothing better to occupy my time," Alaric replied, and then, to Margaret's surprise, his gaze shifted from Clara to her, settling on her with an ease that suggested it was not the first time his attention had wandered in her direction, only the first time he had allowed himself to be caught doing so. "Miss Ashworth," he said, addressing her directly for perhaps the first time all afternoon, "you have said very little. What did you make of the story?" Margaret looked up from her needlework, startled to find herself suddenly the object of conversation. "It was a fine story, Your Grace," she said carefully. "You clearly loved the dog a great deal." "I did," Alaric said, and something in his expression softened, genuine, in a way that caught her off guard. "You have a way of listening, Miss Ashworth, that makes a man feel heard, rather than merely humored. It is a rarer quality than one might think." Clara's smile flickered, just barely, at the edges. "Margaret has always been an excellent listener," she said, and though her words were pleasant enough, there was something beneath them, some faint undertone that Margaret recognized instantly, the sound of a woman noticing something she had not expected to notice. The remainder of the visit passed without further incident, but Margaret felt the shift in the room as clearly as a change in weather, a subtle pressure building somewhere behind her ribs that she could not quite name. When Alaric finally rose to take his leave, he paused beside her chair on his way to the door, longer than courtesy strictly required, and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I hope I have not embarrassed you, Miss Ashworth. I did not intend to single you out." "You did not embarrass me, Your Grace," she said, though her pulse had quickened in a way she resented entirely. "Good," he said, and then, after a brief hesitation, as though considering whether to say more, he simply bowed and took his leave, and Margaret was left standing in the drawing room, with her needlework forgotten in her lap, and her sister's eyes fixed upon her, with an expression she could not quite read. "He looked at you rather a long while," Clara said once the door had closed behind him. "He was merely being polite," Margaret said. "You know how he is, always attentive to everyone in a room." "Is he?" Clara's voice was light, deliberately so, but there was an edge beneath it that had not been there before. "I had not noticed him being quite so attentive to anyone else." Margaret gathered her needlework with hands that were not entirely steady, and rose from her chair, murmuring something about checking on the tea service, and she left the room before her sister could say anything further, before the careful arrangement between them could crack any wider than it already had. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret walked out into the garden, drawn by the cool air and the need to escape the confines of her own chamber, where her thoughts had circled endlessly around the afternoon's small, unsettling moment. She had not gone far along the garden path when she found Nathaniel already there, seated on the low stone bench beneath the old oak tree, a book open on his knee though the light was too poor to read by. "You are out late," she said, pausing at the edge of the path. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "I find this garden restful, even in the dark." "Will you sit?" She hesitated only a moment before joining him on the bench, grateful in truth for the company, after a day that had left her feeling unmoored in ways she could not fully articulate. They sat in silence for a time, the night air carrying the scent of roses and damp earth, and it was Nathaniel who finally spoke. "Something happened today," he said. It was not a question. Margaret considered denying it, as she had denied so much else in recent months, but something about the darkness, the quiet, the steadiness of his presence beside her loosened the knot she had kept tied so tightly for so long. "He looked at me," she said quietly, "during the visit this afternoon. He asked my opinion of a story he told, and he looked at me as though he actually wished to hear the answer." "And that troubled you?" "It should not have troubled me at all," Margaret said. "It should have meant nothing. He is courting my sister. Whatever attention he pays me is simply the ordinary courtesy a man extends to the family of the woman he intends to marry. But it did not feel ordinary to you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark shapes of the hedges, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," she admitted, "it did not." Nathaniel closed his book gently and set it aside, turning to look at her fully. "Margaret, may I speak plainly?" "You always do," she said, with the faintest trace of a smile. "I have known you since we were children," he said. "I have watched you spend your whole life making certain everyone around you was comfortable, happy, cared for, while you yourself went unnoticed, unasked, unconsidered. I watched it happen with your sister's suitors before this one, and I have watched it happen again now, and I confess I find it difficult to keep silent about it any longer." "Nathaniel, let me finish," he said gently. "I do not say this to trouble you further. I say it because I think you deserve, at least once, to have someone ask what you want, rather than what is expected of you. So I am asking, what do you want, Margaret? Not what your aunt wants, not what your sister needs, not what is proper or convenient or easiest for the family. What do you want?" The question hung in the darkness between them, and Margaret found she had no answer ready, not because she did not know, but because she had spent so long refusing to examine the question at all, that the honest answer, when it finally surfaced in her mind, frightened her far more than any polite deflection ever could. "I do not know," she said finally, which was not entirely true, and by the careful, knowing way Nathaniel looked at her in the darkness, she suspected he understood that as well as she did. They sat together a while longer beneath the old oak tree, saying little else of consequence, until the night air grew too cool, and Margaret rose to return to the house. Nathaniel walked her as far as the terrace door, and at the threshold he paused, his hand briefly touching her arm, light and fleeting. "Whatever you decide," he said, "and whatever happens with the Duke and your sister, I hope you will remember that you are allowed to want things for yourself, Margaret. You have spent long enough believing otherwise." She did not sleep well that night either, but for the first time in many weeks, her wakefulness was not entirely made of dread. Somewhere beneath the tangle of guilt and confusion, a small, stubborn seed of something else had begun, quietly, to take root. The days that followed brought no relief from the pressure building steadily around the household. Lady Beaumont, sensing that a formal proposal could not be far off, threw herself into preparations with an energy that left everyone else in the family faintly exhausted. She spoke of guest lists and flower arrangements as though the wedding were already a settled matter rather than a possibility still hanging in uncertain air, and she enlisted Margaret's help in nearly every task, entirely unaware of how each conversation about Clara's future wedding pressed a little harder against the bruise Margaret carried privately beneath her calm exterior. "You must help me decide on the seating for the wedding breakfast," Lady Beaumont announced one afternoon, spreading a large sheet of paper across the drawing-room table, covered already in her aunt's careful looping handwriting. "I cannot possibly manage it alone, and your father has no patience for such details." "The Duke has not yet proposed, Aunt," Margaret reminded her gently, not for the first time. "He will," Lady Beaumont said, waving away the objection with the same confidence she applied to most matters. A man does not call 3 times a week, speak of his feelings before the whole family, and then simply lose interest. He is merely being careful, choosing his moment. Dukes are like that, you know. They like to feel they have arrived at a decision entirely of their own accord, even when the decision was made for them weeks before. Margaret said nothing, bending over the seating chart and offering suggestions where she could, though her mind wandered more than once to the conversation beneath the oak tree, to Nathaniel's quiet question that she still had not properly answered, even to herself. Clara, meanwhile, had grown quieter in recent days, her usual easy confidence replaced by something more watchful. She had said nothing further about the moment at the drawing-room visit when Alaric's attention had lingered on Margaret longer than expected, but Margaret noticed the change all the same, the way Clara's eyes tracked her more carefully now during family gatherings, the way certain warmth that had always existed easily between the sisters had cooled, just slightly, at the edges. It came to a head one evening at a small musical gathering hosted at a neighboring estate, an event Margaret had hoped might pass without incident, given that Alaric was not expected to attend. She was proven wrong within the first quarter hour, when his carriage arrived unannounced, having apparently altered his plans at the last moment upon learning the Ashworth family would be present. He greeted Clara with his usual warmth, offering compliments on her gown, escorting her to a seat near the front of the room, where the evening's performers would soon begin. But as the guests settled and the music started, Margaret found herself seated, quite by accident, in the row directly behind the Duke, close enough that during a pause between pieces, he turned slightly in his seat and addressed her in a low voice. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I did not expect to see you enjoying an evening of music without a piece of needlework in your lap to occupy your hands." "I left it at home tonight, Your Grace," she said, keeping her voice light. "I thought I might actually listen for once." "A wise decision. The soprano is said to be quite exceptional." He paused, studying her for a moment, with an expression she could not quite interpret. "You seem different tonight, Miss Ashworth. Lighter, perhaps." "I could not say what has changed, Your Grace." "Perhaps nothing has," he said. "Perhaps I am simply looking more closely than I once did." The words settled over her with an unexpected weight, and before she could think of a suitable reply, the music resumed, and Alaric turned forward again, leaving Margaret to sit through the remainder of the performance with her thoughts in complete disarray, barely hearing a note of the soprano's celebrated voice. She was not the only one who had noticed the exchange. Across the aisle, Clara sat very still, her eyes fixed forward on the performers, though Margaret could see, even from a distance, the tension in the set of her sister's shoulders, the careful, deliberate way she kept her expression composed. When the interval arrived and the guests rose to mingle and take refreshment, Clara found her way to Margaret's side with the swift, purposeful movement of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "You seem to have a great deal to say to His Grace during the performance," Clara said, her voice pitched carefully low, meant for Margaret's ears alone. "He spoke to me. I answered him. That is all it was, Clara." "That is not all it was, and you know it." Clara's composure, usually so flawless, showed the first genuine crack Margaret had seen in months. "I have watched him look at you for weeks now, Margaret. I have told myself I was imagining it, that it meant nothing, that you would never allow such a thing even if it were true, because you have never once, in your entire life, taken anything for yourself that belonged to me first, but I am beginning to wonder if I have been wrong about that." The accusation, however quietly delivered, struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. "I have done nothing," she said, her voice tight. "I have encouraged nothing. I have sat in that drawing room week after week arranging your courtship, smoothing every awkward silence, making certain the two of you were left alone whenever propriety allowed it. If he looks at me, Clara, it is not because I have invited it." "Then why does it happen at all?" Clara's eyes, usually so bright and easy, had turned sharp, searching. "Why does a man who claims to love me find so many reasons to speak to my sister instead?" Margaret had no answer that would not require confessing everything: the library door, the 4 months of silence, the slow and unwelcome feeling that had grown in her despite every effort to smother it. And so she said nothing at all, which was, she realized too late, its own kind of answer, one that Clara read clearly in the silence stretching between them. "I see," Clara said quietly, and there was something in her voice now that frightened Margaret far more than anger would have, a kind of cold, careful understanding settling over her sister's features. "I see exactly what this is." She turned and walked away before Margaret could find any words at all, leaving her standing alone near the refreshment table, while the murmur of the interval continued around her, oblivious to the quiet, devastating conversation that had just taken place at its edges. Margaret remained there for a long moment, her hands cold despite the warmth of the room, and when she finally looked up, she found Nathaniel watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable, though he made no move to approach, as though he understood, without being told, that whatever had just happened between the sisters was not something he could ease with a quiet word or a shared cup of lemonade. The second half of the concert passed in a blur. Margaret heard none of it. Her mind remained fixed on her sister's face, on the cold understanding that had replaced the warmth Clara had always shown her, and on the growing, uneasy certainty that whatever careful arrangement Margaret had maintained for 4 long months was now, finally and irreversibly, beginning to fall apart. The days following the musical evening passed in a silence far more painful than any argument could have been. Clara did not seek Margaret out, and Margaret, uncertain what she could possibly say that would not make things worse, did not press her sister for conversation either. They moved through the house like two people carefully avoiding the same room, exchanging polite words at meals when their father or aunt required it, and nothing more. Lady Beaumont, absorbed as always in her plans for the coming wedding that had not yet been proposed, seemed entirely unaware of the widening distance between her nieces. She continued to speak of guest lists and flower arrangements over breakfast, oblivious to the tension that had settled over the table like a fog neither sister could see through clearly enough to address. It was Baron Ashworth who first noticed something was amiss. He was not a man given to prying into the private affairs of his daughters, having always trusted them to manage their own friendships and disagreements, but even he could not fail to observe the strained quiet that had replaced the easy warmth once shared between Margaret and Clara. "Is something troubling between you two?" he asked Margaret one evening, finding her alone in the study where she had gone to escape the heaviness of the drawing room. "You have hardly spoken to your sister in days." "We are simply occupied with different matters, father," Margaret said, keeping her eyes on the ledger she had been pretending to review. "It is nothing of consequence." He studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the uncomfortable sense that he saw more than she wished him to, though he did not press further. "Whatever it is," he said finally, "I trust the two of you to settle it between yourselves. Sisters have quarreled since the beginning of time, and found their way back to one another. I do not imagine you will be the exception." Margaret wished she shared his confidence. The true unraveling came a few days later, on an afternoon when Alaric called at the house unannounced, hoping, he said, to speak with Clara privately about a matter of some importance. Lady Beaumont, delighted at what she assumed could only mean an imminent proposal, hurried to arrange the drawing room and insisted Margaret remain nearby as chaperone, as propriety required, though she instructed her niece to keep a discreet distance and allow the young couple room to speak freely. Margaret took her seat near the window, her needlework once again a useless prop in her lap, and watched as Alaric settled across from Clara with an expression more serious than she had seen him wear before. "Miss Ashworth," he began, addressing Clara formally, "I have thought a great deal in recent days about what I said at your family's table, and about everything that has passed between us since. I owe you an honest conversation, and I find I can no longer put it off." Clara's hands folded tightly in her lap. "Go on, Your Grace." "When I spoke of my feelings that evening, I believed them entirely true," Alaric said, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten, sensing already the direction the conversation was about to take. "I had admired you for months, genuinely, and I do not wish to suggest otherwise. But in the weeks since, I have found myself uncertain in a way I did not expect, and I think it would be a disservice to you, and to myself, to continue this courtship without being honest about that uncertainty." "Uncertain how?" Clara's voice was steady, though Margaret could hear the effort it cost her to keep it so. Alaric hesitated, glancing, almost against his will, toward the window where Margaret sat, before returning his attention to Clara. "I do not fully understand it myself," he admitted. "I only know that something has shifted, and I owe you the honesty of saying so rather than proceeding toward an understanding I am no longer certain I can offer with a whole heart." The silence that followed stretched long and unbearable. Clara sat very still, her composure a visible effort now rather than the effortless grace she usually wore, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge Margaret had rarely heard from her sister. "I think, Your Grace," Clara said slowly, "that you ought to examine more closely where your uncertainty has come from. I do not believe it appeared from nowhere." Alaric's expression flickered, something like recognition passing briefly across his features, though he said nothing to confirm or deny whatever thought had crossed his mind. "I did not come here today to cause you pain," he said instead. "I came because I thought you deserved honesty rather than false promises." "How generous of you," Clara said, and though her tone remained composed, the bitterness beneath it was unmistakable. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with hands that were not quite steady. "I think, Your Grace, that this conversation has reached its natural end. I appreciate your honesty, however late it has arrived." Alaric rose as well, clearly uncertain how to proceed in the face of her cool dismissal. "Clara, I would prefer you address me formally, Your Grace, given the circumstances," Clara said, and the correction landed with quiet precision. He bowed, murmured something about calling again when it might be more welcome, and took his leave, casting one last uncertain glance toward Margaret as he passed her chair by the window, a glance she felt rather than fully saw, her own eyes fixed determinedly on the needlework she had not touched throughout the entire conversation. The moment the door closed behind him, Clara turned to face her sister, and whatever restraint she had maintained in Alaric's presence dissolved entirely. "You knew," Clara said, her voice low and shaking. "You knew this would happen. I saw your face just now, Margaret. You were not surprised by a single word he said." "Clara, please." "How long?" Clara demanded, stepping closer. "How long have you known that his feelings had changed, or perhaps that they were never truly for me at all? Was it only these past weeks, or has it been longer than that? Tell me the truth, Margaret. For once in your life, tell me the truth, instead of managing me the way you manage everything else in this house." Margaret set down her needlework, her hands trembling now beyond any hope of concealment, and she looked at her sister's face, flushed with hurt and anger, and understood that the careful arrangement she had maintained for 4 long months could not survive this moment intact. 4 months, she said quietly. "I overheard him in the library in early spring, speaking to Edmund Whitmore, before he had ever formally called on you. He spoke your name, Clara. He said he could not stop thinking of you. I heard every word, and I told no one, because I did not think it was my place, and because I believed, truly believed, that whatever I felt about it did not matter." Clara's face went very still. "Whatever you felt about it," she repeated slowly. "So there was something to feel." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, exhausted by months of careful silence finally breaking apart all at once. "I do not fully understand it myself," she said, echoing, without meaning to, the very words Alaric had spoken moments before. "I never intended for anything to develop. I never once encouraged his attention. Clara, you must believe that. But something has grown regardless, something I have tried for months to bury, and I am sorry, more sorry than I know how to express, that it has caused you this pain." For a long moment Clara said nothing at all, simply studying her sister's face as though seeing her clearly for the first time in years. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by something quieter and more wounded. "All this time," Clara said, "I thought you were helping me because you cared for my happiness. I never once imagined you were managing your own feelings behind every kind gesture, every arranged tea, every moment you excused yourself so he and I might be alone. Do you know how that makes me feel, Margaret? As though everything between us these past months has been a performance you were giving for my benefit, while you carried something entirely different underneath it." "That is not fair," Margaret said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were entirely true. "Perhaps not," Clara said, "but it does not feel unfair to me right now." She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at her sister with an expression Margaret could not fully read, grief and anger, and something almost like relief tangled together. "I need time, Margaret. I cannot look at you properly right now, not without thinking of everything you kept from me. Please, do not follow me." She left the room without waiting for a response, and Margaret sat alone by the window for a long while afterward, the needlework forgotten entirely in her lap, the sound of her sister's footsteps fading down the corridor and up the stairs, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything Margaret had carried in the 4 long months since a library door had first changed everything. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow descent, indifferent to the wreckage it illuminated within the house, and Margaret realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that there was no path forward now that led back to how things had been before. Whatever came next, the careful, quiet life she had built around other people's happiness had finally, irreversibly, come undone. News of the broken understanding between Clara and the Duke reached Lady Beaumont within the hour, delivered not by either sister but by a housemaid who had overheard enough of the raised voices in the drawing room to draw her own conclusions. Lady Beaumont arrived at Margaret's door in a state of visible distress, her usual composure entirely abandoned. "Tell me this is some misunderstanding," she said, wringing her hands as she paced the small space of Margaret's chamber. "Tell me the Duke has not withdrawn his affections after everything I have arranged, after every letter I have written, every guest I have quietly informed of the coming match." I do not think it was ever fully settled, Aunt, Margaret said carefully. He never formally proposed. That is beside the point entirely, Lady Beaumont said, dropping into the chair beside the window with a heaviness that suggested genuine despair rather than mere social embarrassment. A duke does not announce his feelings at a family dinner and then simply withdraw them weeks later without cause. Something must have happened. Clara would not simply lose his interest without reason. She paused, and her sharp eyes settled on Margaret with sudden, uncomfortable focus, unless the reason was never truly about losing interest in her at all. Margaret said nothing, and her silence, she realized too late, was answer enough for a woman as perceptive as her aunt. Margaret. Lady Beaumont's voice had dropped, quieter now, though no less intense. Tell me I am wrong. I never sought his attention, Aunt. I want you to understand that clearly. I did not ask whether you sought it, Lady Beaumont said. I asked whether it exists. When Margaret still did not answer, her aunt closed her eyes briefly, as though absorbing a blow she had not quite anticipated. Oh, Margaret. What a tangle you have allowed to grow beneath all our noses. I did not allow anything, Margaret said, some spark of defiance rising in her despite her exhaustion. I have spent 4 months trying to bury it entirely. I have said nothing, done nothing, encouraged nothing. If you wish to be angry with someone, Aunt, perhaps you might direct some small portion of it toward the Duke, who is, after all, the one who changed his own mind. Lady Beaumont studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, the sharp edges of her distress giving way to something more thoughtful. You have always been the sensible one, she said. I confess I never imagined you capable of inspiring this particular sort of trouble. I am not certain whether to be more astonished or more concerned. Neither am I, Aunt, Margaret admitted quietly. Lady Beaumont left shortly after, murmuring something about needing to consider how best to manage the situation before word spread further through their social circle, and Margaret was left alone once more, the weight of the afternoon pressing down on her with renewed force. She did not see Clara again that evening. Her sister remained in her own chamber, and Margaret respected the request for distance, however much it pained her to do so, knowing that whatever words she might offer now would land poorly against the freshness of Clara's hurt. It was near dusk when Margaret finally left the house, drawn once more to the garden, the one place that had offered her any measure of peace in recent weeks. She was not entirely surprised to find Nathaniel there again, though this time he rose the moment he saw her approaching, his expression grave. I heard something happen this afternoon, he said. The whole house seems to know it, one way or another. Clara knows the truth now, Margaret said, sinking onto the stone bench with a weariness that went beyond the physical. About the library, about how long I have known, about everything I have carried and never spoken aloud until today. She is furious with me, and I cannot entirely blame her for it. Nathaniel sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, though he made no move to close the remaining distance. How do you feel? He asked, and there was something in the simplicity of the question, the way he always seemed to ask after her feelings rather than the facts of the situation, that nearly undid the fragile composure she had managed to maintain through the entire difficult afternoon. Relieved, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the word as soon as she spoke it, which feels a terrible thing to say, given how much pain it has caused my sister. But I have carried this alone for 4 months, Nathaniel. And however badly the truth has landed, there is some part of me that is glad, finally, not to be carrying it in silence any longer. That does not sound terrible to me, Nathaniel said gently. It sounds like a woman who has been holding her breath for far too long, finally allowing herself to exhale. Margaret looked at him in the fading light, at the steady, patient concern that had never once wavered in all the months she had watched this slow unraveling take place, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily recall, that perhaps she was not entirely alone in whatever came next. What happens now? She asked quietly, though she was not certain whether she meant the question for him, for herself, or for the uncertain future stretching out ahead of the whole tangled family. I do not know, Nathaniel said honestly, but I do not think you need to face it pretending everything is well, Margaret. Not anymore. Perhaps that at least is a small mercy in all of this. They sat together as the light faded fully from the garden, saying little else. And though nothing had been resolved, though her sister's hurt still weighed heavily on her conscience, and the future of the whole household remained entirely uncertain, Margaret found, for the first time in 4 long months, that she no longer felt quite so alone beneath the weight of it. A week passed before the household regained anything resembling its ordinary rhythm, and even then, the change beneath the surface remained impossible to ignore. Clara had softened, slightly, in her manner toward Margaret, no longer avoiding her entirely, though the easy warmth the sisters had once shared remained noticeably absent from their exchanges. They spoke of small things, meals and weather and household matters, careful to avoid anything that might reopen the wound still healing between them. Word of the broken courtship had, despite Lady Beaumont's best efforts at discretion, begun to circulate through the wider social circle, and invitations arrived now carrying an undertone of curiosity that had not existed before. Hostesses eager to observe firsthand how the Ashworth family conducted itself in the aftermath of such a public unraveling. It was in this atmosphere of careful scrutiny that the Hartwell ball arrived, an event that had been planned for months and could not, without considerable scandal, be avoided by any of the families involved. Margaret had hoped to attend quietly, to remain at the edges of the room as she always did, but she understood, dressing for the evening with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure, that quiet edges would not be permitted to her tonight. Too many eyes would be watching, too many whispers already circulating about the sister who had somehow captured a duke's attention meant for another. The ballroom, when they arrived, glittered with candlelight and the low murmur of 100 private conversations, many of which, Margaret suspected, concerned her family directly. Clara moved through the room with practiced grace, her chin held high, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her diminished, and Margaret found herself admiring her sister's resilience, even as guilt continued to gnaw quietly at her conscience. It was inevitable, given the size of the gathering and the interconnected nature of the guests, that Alaric would be present as well. Margaret spotted him across the room within the first quarter hour, standing near a group of gentlemen, his gaze already searching the crowd with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. When his eyes finally found hers, he did not look away, and something in his expression, open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen him allow in public, sent a current of alarm through her entire body. She turned quickly, seeking refuge near a group of older matrons discussing the evening's music, but she could feel his attention on her still, a warmth at her back that she could not entirely ignore no matter how determinedly she avoided meeting it directly. Nathaniel found her not long after, offering his arm for the next dance with the casual ease of long familiarity, and Margaret accepted gratefully, glad for the distraction of movement and music, glad too for the steady, uncomplicated comfort of his company, amid a room that suddenly felt full of watching eyes. "You seem determined not to look in his direction," Nathaniel observed, as they moved through the steps of the dance. "I am determined to survive this evening without further incident," Margaret said. "That is all." "A reasonable goal," Nathaniel said, though there was a gentle amusement in his voice that suggested he doubted her success. "Though I confess, watching you avoid him with such energy is itself rather conspicuous. You might attract less attention simply speaking to him briefly and moving on." "You make it sound remarkably simple." "Perhaps it is simpler than you are allowing it to be," he said, and something in his tone had grown quieter, more serious, beneath the polite rhythm of the dance. "Margaret, whatever happens tonight, whatever comes of any of this, I want you to know that I have meant every word I have said to you these past weeks. You deserve to want something for yourself, without guilt, without apology. I only wish it were easier for you to believe that." The dance ended before she could formulate any response worthy of his honesty, and he bowed and stepped back with a small, knowing smile, leaving her standing at the edge of the floor, with her heart beating rather faster than the exertion of the dance alone could explain. It was during the supper interval that the confrontation Margaret had been dreading all evening finally arrived, though not in the form she had expected. She had stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the garden, seeking a moment of cool air away from the crowded ballroom, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find not Alaric, as she had half feared, but Clara. "I thought I might find you out here," Clara said, joining her at the balcony railing. "You have always preferred the edges of a room to its center." "I did not wish to intrude on your evening," Margaret said carefully. "You have handled everyone's curious stares with more grace than I could have managed." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking out over the darkened garden below, the distant sound of music drifting through the open doors behind them. "I have had a week to think," she said finally, "about the Duke, about you, about everything that happened between us. I was angry, Margaret. I am still angry, if I am entirely honest. But I have also had time to consider things more clearly than I could in the moment. Clara, I am so sorry." "Let me finish," Clara said, not unkindly, and Margaret fell silent. "I have asked myself these past days whether I truly loved him or whether I simply enjoyed being chosen, being the one a duke had selected above every other woman in every ballroom this season. I do not think it was love, Margaret. I think it was flattery, And flattery is a poor foundation for a marriage, however pleasant it feels in the moment. Margaret studied her sister's face in the dim light, searching for the anger she had expected to find still simmering there, and found instead something quieter, more contemplative. "You are not still hurt?" "I did not say that," Clara said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. "I am still hurt. My pride took a considerable blow, and I do not forgive that easily. But I have realized, thinking it over, that my hurt was never truly about losing him. It was about discovering that my sister had kept something so significant from me for months, and about wondering what that meant for everything else between us that I had always taken for granted."
"I should have told you sooner,"
Margaret said.
"I have thought of little else since that evening."
"I told myself my silence was protecting you, but I wonder now if it was simply protecting myself." "Perhaps both things were true at once," Clara said. "You have always been like that, Margaret. Careful and quiet and certain that your own wants mattered less than everyone else's comfort. I used to admire it, now I think it has cost you a great deal more than either of us realized." They stood together in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing, slowly, into something closer to the warmth they had once shared. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked eventually. "About him, I mean." "Nothing," Clara said simply. "I have no wish to continue a courtship built on confusion and mistaken feelings. If he wishes to pursue you honestly, Margaret, then I think he ought to do so, without any further pretense on either side. I will not stand in the way of it, though I admit it will take me some time to feel entirely at peace with the shape of things." "Clara." "Do not thank me," Clara said, cutting her off gently. "I am not doing this out of generosity alone. I am doing it because pretending otherwise would only prolong an unhappiness none of us needs to carry any longer. And because, whatever has passed between us these last weeks, you are still my sister, and I find I do not wish to lose that over a man I am no longer certain I ever truly wanted." Margaret felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, and she reached for her sister's hand, relieved beyond words when Clara did not pull away. "I have missed you," she said quietly. "These past days, I have missed you terribly." "I have missed you as well," Clara admitted, though I was too proud to say so until tonight. They returned to the ballroom together a short while later, arm in arm, and if the gossips watching from the edges of the room had expected further scandal from the sisters, they were disappointed, finding instead two women who appeared, for the first time in weeks, entirely at ease in one another's company. It was near the end of the evening that Alaric finally found the opportunity to approach Margaret directly, catching her during a rare moment alone near the refreshment table while Clara danced with a gentleman of the neighboring county. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was none of his usual practiced charm in his voice now, only a raw uncertainty that surprised her. "I have wanted to speak with you properly for days, but I did not know how to begin, or whether you would even wish to hear it." "Your Grace, I am not certain this is the place." "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but I find I can wait no longer to say it. I was wrong to speak so carelessly at your family's table months ago. I convinced myself of a great many things that evening, wine and impatience clouding what I ought to have examined more carefully first. I have thought of little else since our conversation at the concert, and I find myself unable to continue pretending that my feelings point where I once believed they did." Margaret's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "Your Grace, please, my sister has only just found peace with what has passed. I will not be the cause of further disruption to this family, not after everything we have already survived this month." "I am not asking you to disrupt anything tonight," Alaric said gently. "I am only asking whether, when the time is right, whether you would permit me to speak with you honestly, without an audience, without the weight of everything that has come before hanging over every word." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, torn between the caution 4 months of silence had taught her, and the small, persistent hope she had tried so hard, and so unsuccessfully, to extinguish. "Perhaps," she said finally, "when the time is right." It was not a promise, not quite, but it was more than she had allowed herself to offer anyone in a very long time. And as she watched him bow and step away, some fragile, uncertain thing settled quietly into place within her chest, a feeling she did not yet trust but could no longer bring herself to deny entirely. Across the room, Nathaniel watched the brief exchange from a distance, his expression carefully neutral, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he understood precisely what had just passed between them, and what it might mean for whatever quiet hope he himself had been nursing these past weeks in silence, much as Margaret had once done with her own. The carriage ride home was quiet, Lady Beaumont dozing lightly against the cushioned seat after an evening she declared with some relief to have passed without any fresh scandal attaching itself to the family name. Clara sat beside Margaret, her head resting briefly against her sister's shoulder in a gesture so familiar from their childhood that it nearly brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. "You spoke with him," Clara murmured, not quite a question, "near the end of the evening." "I did," Margaret admitted. "I did not seek him out, Clara. He approached me." "I know," Clara said. "I saw the way he watched the room all evening, waiting for a moment to find you alone. I am not upset by it, truly. I told you already. I have made my peace with how things have unfolded, however strange it still feels some hours." She paused, and in the dim light of the carriage, Margaret could see a small, rueful smile touch her sister's lips. "I only hope, whatever comes of it, that you will not make yourself as miserable pursuing your own happiness as you were content to be miserable pursuing mine." Margaret laughed softly despite herself, the sound surprising in the quiet carriage. "I make no promises," she said. "Old habits, as you well know, are not easily broken." "Then I shall simply have to remind you," Clara said, "as often as necessary." They arrived home well after midnight, and the household settled quickly into sleep, though Margaret found herself once again too restless for rest, her thoughts circling endlessly around the evening's events, around Alaric's careful, uncertain words near the refreshment table, around the fragile, unfamiliar hope that had begun to take root somewhere beneath her ribs despite every effort at caution. She did not see Nathaniel again for several days after the ball, an absence that struck her as unusual given how frequently he had called at the house in recent weeks, and she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, missing his steady presence more than she had expected to. When he finally did call, he seemed changed in some subtle way she could not immediately name, his manner still warm but carrying an undercurrent of reserve that had not existed between them before. "You have been scarce this week," Margaret observed, as they walked together through the garden, a habit that had become comfortable between them over the preceding months. "I have had matters to attend to," Nathaniel said, though his tone suggested there was more to the absence than simple business. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the path ahead rather than on her. "I saw you speaking with the Duke at the Hartwell ball," he said finally. "It seemed a rather significant conversation, from where I stood." Margaret felt her cheeks warm, uncertain how to answer. "He wished to apologize for the manner of his announcement and for the confusion it caused my family." "Is that all it was?" Nathaniel asked, and there was something careful in the question, something that told her he already suspected the answer was more complicated than her simple explanation allowed. She considered lying, offering him the same practiced deflection she had once offered so easily to everyone around her, but she found, standing there in the garden with a man who had never once asked less of her than complete honesty, that she could not bring herself to do it. "He asked if he might speak with me properly, when the time is right," she admitted. "I did not give him an answer, not truly. I told him only that perhaps, when the time is right, I would hear him." Nathaniel nodded slowly, absorbing this, his expression carefully composed in a way that told her the composure cost him something. "I see," he said. "I confess I had hoped, after everything these past weeks, that perhaps circumstances might have led elsewhere." The quiet ache in his voice struck her more deeply than she expected, and she stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Nathaniel," she said, "I do not know what circumstances will lead to, truthfully. I have spent 4 months so consumed by feelings I did not choose and could not seem to master, that I have hardly had room to consider anything beyond simply surviving each day as it came. I do not say that to dismiss what has grown between us these past weeks. I say it because you, of everyone in my life, have always deserved my honesty, and I find I cannot offer you less than that now." "I would not want less than that," Nathaniel said quietly. "I have known for some time that your heart was occupied elsewhere, Margaret, even before you fully understood it yourself. I have not minded standing beside you regardless, because your friendship alone has always been worth having, whatever else might or might not follow it. I only ask that whatever you decide, in whatever direction your heart finally settles, you decide it honestly, and not simply because it is easier or more expected than the alternative." Margaret felt the weight of his words settle over her, gentle but unmistakably clear, and she reached for his hand, grateful beyond measure for a friendship that had asked nothing of her these past months except her honesty, and had offered, in return, more steady comfort than she had known how to properly value until circumstances forced her to examine it closely. "Thank you," she said simply, "for never once asking me to be anything other than exactly what I was, uncertain and complicated and entirely unresolved." "That," Nathaniel said, with a small, genuine smile, "has never been difficult, Margaret. It has simply been true." They walked on together in comfortable silence, the garden settling into evening around them, and though nothing had been fully resolved between any of the three people whose futures had become so unexpectedly entangled that spring, Margaret found herself, for the first time in a long while, willing to let the uncertainty simply exist, without forcing it toward an answer before she was ready to give one. Summer settled fully over the Ashworth estate in the weeks that followed, bringing with it a strange, fragile calm that Margaret had not expected to find so soon after months of quiet turmoil. Clara had begun, tentatively, to enjoy the attentions of other suitors, none of them dukes, none of them accompanied by the breathless expectation Lady Beaumont had once attached to Alaric's courtship, but each of them offered with an ease and lightness that suggested Clara herself was relieved to have stepped back from a match built more on flattery than genuine affection. "I danced twice with Mr. Fairweather at the assembly last night," Clara announced one morning over breakfast, a note of genuine pleasure in her voice that Margaret had not heard in months. "He has none of the Duke's polish, but he made me laugh 3 times, and I confess I found that considerably more valuable than I once might have." "He seems a kind man," Margaret said, and meant it. "He is," Clara agreed, "and he has never once looked at you instead of me during an entire evening, which I find myself appreciating more than I expected to." She said it lightly, without any lingering edge of hurt, and Margaret felt, not for the first time in recent weeks, a quiet gratitude for how far her sister had come in learning to speak of the whole strange episode without bitterness. Alaric had called only once since the Hartwell ball, a brief and carefully proper visit during which he had spoken mostly with Baron Ashworth about matters of little consequence, offering Margaret nothing beyond polite greeting in front of the rest of the family. She had wondered, in the days following, whether his earlier words at the ball had been simply the product of an emotional evening, easily forgotten once ordinary life resumed its steady pace. The thought brought with it a complicated tangle of relief and disappointment that she did not examine too closely. It was Nathaniel's steady, undemanding presence that had filled the uncertain weeks since, and Margaret found herself increasingly grateful for the ease of his company, for conversations that asked nothing of her beyond simple honesty, for a friendship that had never once required her to perform contentment she did not feel. If some quiet, unspoken question remained between them, neither pressed the other to answer it before they were ready, and Margaret found a peculiar comfort in that patience, so different from the breathless uncertainty that had characterized her feelings toward Alaric for months. The letter arrived on a warm afternoon in late June, delivered by a footman, while Margaret sat alone in the garden with a book she had not managed to read a single page of. It bore Alaric's seal, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke it open, uncertain what she hoped to find within. The words, when she read them, were simpler than she had expected, less polished than his usual careful phrases, as though he had written and rewritten them a dozen times before finally allowing the plainest version to stand. He wrote of the months since the dinner where he had first spoken so carelessly, of the confusion that had followed, of the slow, uncomfortable process of examining his own heart honestly, rather than simply following the expectations that had been laid before him by his own impatience and the eagerness of everyone around him. He wrote that he had given her space these past weeks precisely because he wished to be certain, entirely certain, before he spoke again, that what he felt was real and lasting, rather than the fleeting product of a difficult season. He asked, at the letter's close, whether she might permit him to call the following afternoon, alone, so that he might finally say properly what he had failed to say honestly the first time. Margaret sat with the letter in her lap for a long while after reading it, the garden quiet around her, and found that the fear she had expected to feel had been replaced, somewhere in the intervening weeks, by something steadier and more certain than she had allowed herself to trust before. She showed the letter to Clara that evening, uncertain whether it was the right thing to do but unwilling, after everything they had survived together, to keep another secret from her sister. Clara read it slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than pained. "He has taken his time," she said finally, handing the letter back. "I suppose that speaks well of him, that he did not rush toward you the moment things ended with me, the way he rushed toward speaking his feelings that first evening. Does it trouble you that he wishes to call?" Clara considered the question seriously, as though weighing it honestly, rather than offering an easy reassurance. "A little," she admitted. "I will not pretend otherwise. But less than I expected it to, and less each day that passes. I have had these weeks to build something of my own, Margaret, however small it still is, and I find my heart is considerably less tangled up in his than it once was." She reached for her sister's hand across the small table between them. "You should see him tomorrow. Whatever comes of it, you deserve to hear him out honestly, and to answer just as honestly in return." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for being far more generous than I would have managed, in your place." "Do not thank me too quickly," Clara said, with a faint, teasing smile that reminded Margaret sharply of the easy warmth they had shared before any of this had begun. I intend to demand every detail afterward. Generosity has its limits. Alaric arrived the following afternoon precisely at the hour he had requested, and Margaret received him alone in the small parlor at the back of the house, away from the more formal drawing room where so much of their earlier, more complicated history had unfolded. He looked, she thought, less composed than she had ever seen him, his usual easy confidence replaced by a careful, deliberate seriousness that suited him, she realized, rather well. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, once the door had closed and they were alone. "Your letter was honest," Margaret said. "I thought it deserved an honest response." He nodded, seeming to gather himself before continuing. "I have thought a great deal these past weeks about the man I was that evening at your family's table," he said. Impatient, careless with words that were never truly mine to speak so publicly, so certain of a feeling I had not properly examined before declaring it in front of your entire family. I have come to understand, slowly and rather uncomfortably, that what I felt for your sister was real in its way, but shallow, built more on admiration than on anything I now recognize as genuine love. I did not understand the difference until circumstances forced me to examine my own heart more honestly than I had ever bothered to before. "And what did you find, once you examined it?" Margaret asked, though she suspected from the steady warmth in his eyes that she already knew. "I found you," Alaric said simply. "I found that every conversation that mattered to me these past months, every moment I remember clearly from an entire difficult season, involved you rather than the courtship I had so publicly declared. I found that I had been looking in the wrong direction entirely, dazzled by what was easy to admire rather than paying attention to what actually moved me. I am sorry it took me so long to understand it properly, and sorrier still for the pain my carelessness caused both you and your sister along the way." Margaret felt something in her chest loosen, a tightness she had carried for so many months that its absence felt almost unfamiliar. "I overheard you," she said quietly, "months ago, before any of this began. I was passing the library, and I heard you speaking to Edmund about your feelings, and I heard you say my sister's name. I have carried that knowledge every single day since, through every visit, every careful arrangement, every moment I told myself what I felt did not matter, because your heart belonged to someone else." Alaric's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complicated. "All this time," he said slowly, "you knew before I ever called properly, before I ever spoke a single word to your family about my feelings. You watched the entire courtship unfold, knowing what you knew, and you said nothing." "I did not think it was my place to say anything," Margaret said, "and I did not fully understand my own feelings clearly enough for a long while to know what there was to say." "And now?" Alaric asked, stepping closer, his voice low and careful. "Do you understand them now?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment, weighing 4 months of silence against the steady, patient honesty he had finally offered her, weighing too the quiet, undemanding friendship Nathaniel had given her throughout the entire ordeal. A friendship she valued more than she had fully allowed herself to acknowledge until this very moment. She thought of her sister's generous blessing, of the careful, honest letter that had brought Alaric to her parlor door, and she found, when she finally answered, that the words came more easily than she had expected. "I understand that I have spent a great deal of my life believing my own wants mattered less than everyone else's," she said. "I understand that I nearly let that belief cost me the chance to be honest, with you, with my sister, and with myself. And I understand that whatever grew between us these past months, however complicated its beginning, it was real, and I am no longer willing to bury it simply because it once felt safer to stay quiet." Alaric's expression softened into something like relief, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently rather than pressing for more than she had already offered. "Then may I call on you properly?" he asked, not in secret, not through careless words spoken at a crowded table, but honestly, in the open, with your family's full knowledge and your own complete willingness? "You may," Margaret said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she meant it entirely. The conversation that followed with her father was considerably less dramatic than the one that had first announced Alaric's feelings so many months before. Baron Ashworth listened carefully as Margaret explained, as honestly as she could manage, the tangled history of the past several months, and though he raised an eyebrow more than once at the complexity of it all, he offered his blessing readily enough, provided Margaret herself was certain of her own heart. "I am certain," Margaret told him, and found, saying it aloud, that the certainty had settled into her more completely than she had expected it to. Lady Beaumont, upon learning the news, declared herself entirely unsurprised, insisting she had suspected the truth of the matter for weeks, a claim Margaret accepted with good humor rather than correction, grateful simply for her aunt's enthusiastic, if somewhat revised, support. Clara, when told properly, embraced her sister with a warmth that erased whatever lingering distance had remained between them since the difficult weeks of summer. "I am glad," she said simply. "Truly glad, Margaret, and not merely because it spares me the trouble of pretending otherwise." Nathaniel received the news with quiet grace when Margaret finally found the courage to tell him herself, walking with him once more through the familiar garden that had witnessed so much of the past month's quiet unraveling. "I suspected as much," he said, though something in his voice carried a gentleness that suggested the news, however expected, still cost him something to hear. "I hope you will be happy, Margaret. Truly, you have earned it, after everything." "You have been the steadiest friend I have ever known," Margaret told him, meaning every word. "I do not think I would have survived these past months with any measure of grace at all, without you beside me through every difficult turn of it." "Then perhaps that is enough," Nathaniel said, with a small, genuine smile that held more warmth than sorrow. "A friendship worth having, even if it never became anything more." By the time autumn arrived, bringing cooler evenings and the turning colors of the garden that had witnessed so much of the summer's quiet drama, the household had settled into a new and more honest rhythm. Alaric called openly now, welcomed without pretense or careful management, and Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily recall, entirely unafraid to want something plainly and openly for herself. Clara's own happiness, quieter and less dazzling than a duke's attention but steadier for its honesty, continued to grow in its own good time. And the sisters, having weathered the worst of what secrets and misplaced feelings could do to even the closest of bonds, found their way back to something even stronger than what had come before. The dinner table that had once been the site of such careless, thoughtless words became, in the months that followed, a place of easy conversation once more, the whole family gathered together without the weight of hidden knowledge pressing down on any one of them, honest at last, and all the better for it. It was at that very table, on a crisp evening in early October, that Alaric finally asked Margaret formally for her hand, though this time there was no wine-loosened carelessness in his manner, no impulsive declaration blurted out before he had properly considered its consequences. He had spoken with Baron Ashworth privately that afternoon, securing permission in the proper, measured way such matters were meant to unfold, and when he rose from his seat at dinner that evening, the entire family already seemed to sense what was coming, though none of them, this time, appeared the least bit surprised by it. "Margaret," he said, and his voice, though steady, carried a warmth entirely different from the nervous urgency of that first fateful announcement so many months before. "I have spent the better part of this year learning the difference between admiration and love, between what is easy to notice in a crowded room, and what quietly, patiently proves itself true over months of difficulty and honesty. I do not wish to repeat the mistake I made at this very table, speaking carelessly before I had properly considered my words. So let me say plainly, in front of your family, who have already forgiven me more than I perhaps deserved, that I love you, Margaret Ashworth, entirely and without confusion, and I would be honored beyond words if you would consent to be my wife." Margaret, feeling the weight of every eye at the table upon her, found that she did not mind it in the least this time, not the way she once might have. She looked around at her father's proud, steady face, at Lady Beaumont dabbing already at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, at Clara smiling with genuine warmth rather than any lingering shadow of old hurt, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at ease with being seen. "Yes," she said simply. "I would be honored as well." The table erupted into warm congratulations, Lady Beaumont already beginning, within moments, to speak of wedding dates and guest lists, with an enthusiasm that made Clara laugh outright, a bright, easy sound that filled the dining room with a warmth Margaret had feared, during the darkest weeks of summer, might never fully return between them. The wedding itself took place the following spring, exactly 1 year after the library conversation that had first, unknowingly, set the whole complicated story into motion. It was a smaller affair than Lady Beaumont might once have wished for a duke's wedding, held in the small chapel near the estate rather than in some grand cathedral in town, but Margaret found she preferred it that way, surrounded by the people who had witnessed and weathered every difficult turn of the past year alongside her. Clara stood beside her sister throughout the ceremony, radiant in a gown of soft green, her own quiet happiness with Mr. Fairweather, whose courtship had deepened steadily over the autumn and winter months, evident in the easy warmth of her smile. Nathaniel attended as well, standing near the back of the small chapel, and though Margaret caught his eye only briefly during the ceremony, the look he offered her carried nothing but genuine, unguarded happiness. The last quiet trace of old hope settled, at last, into simple friendship, steady and unburdened by anything left unsaid. After the ceremony, as the small gathering spilled out into the spring sunshine outside the chapel, Margaret found a moment alone with her sister, the two of them standing slightly apart from the celebration, much as they had once stood apart on the balcony at the Hartwell ball months before, though the silence between them now carried none of that earlier evening's uncertainty. "Do you remember," Clara said, looping her arm through Margaret's, "that dreadful dinner where all of this began? I have never forgiven him properly for choosing that particular moment to announce himself, wine and all. I remember every detail of it," Margaret admitted. "I do not think I shall ever forget the sound of that wine glass breaking." "Nor I," Clara said, laughing softly, "though I confess, looking back on it now, I find myself almost grateful for his carelessness that evening. Had he waited, had he approached things properly and quietly from the start, I do not know that any of us would have found our way to exactly where we are now." Margaret considered this, watching Alaric across the churchyard, speaking warmly with her father, and found she could not entirely disagree. "Perhaps some truths need to be spoken carelessly," she said, "before they can finally be spoken honestly." "Perhaps," Clara agreed, "though I would still advise against blurting out one's deepest feelings over the roasted pheasant, should you ever find yourself giving advice to young suitors in the future." Margaret laughed, the sound easy and unguarded, and the two sisters stood together in the spring sunshine a while longer, watching the small, hard-won gathering of family and friends who had carried them, each in their own difficult way, from that first shattering announcement to this quiet, honest, and thoroughly deserved happiness. 3 years had passed since the spring wedding in the small chapel near the Ashworth estate, and the household that had once been consumed by whispered secrets and careful silences had settled, in the time since, into something Margaret had never quite dared to imagine for herself during those difficult months of her sister's courtship. She stood now at the window of her own drawing room, in the home she shared with Alaric, a comfortable distance from her father's estate, close enough for frequent visits but far enough to feel entirely her own. Below, in the garden that had become her particular pride over the past 3 years, her young daughter chased after a small dog with the same fierce determination Margaret remembered from her own childhood games in a different garden altogether. "She has your stubbornness," Alaric said, coming to stand beside her at the window, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of 3 years of marriage. "She has your recklessness," Margaret countered, watching their daughter tumble over a low hedge and pick herself back up without a single tear, laughing instead. "I dread to think what qualities she will have inherited by the time she is fully grown. A formidable combination, I should think," Alaric said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Rather like her mother." Margaret smiled, leaning briefly into him before her attention was drawn by the sound of a carriage approaching along the drive, and she recognized it immediately as her sister's, the crest visible even from this distance. Clara had married Mr. Fairweather in a quiet autumn ceremony 2 years prior, and though their life together carried none of the grandeur that had once seemed destined for her, Margaret had never seen her sister happier. Clara stepped down from the carriage now with the easy confidence of a woman entirely secure in her own choices, and behind her followed her husband, a genial, unpretentious man who had never once, in all the time Margaret had known him, made Clara feel like anything less than his equal. "You are early," Margaret said, meeting her sister at the door with a warm embrace. "I had not expected you until tomorrow." "I could not wait," Clara said, her eyes bright with an excitement she made no effort to conceal. "I have news, and I did not trust myself to hold it in my chest a single day longer." Margaret studied her sister's face, taking in the particular glow that had nothing to do with fashion or flattery, and felt a slow, delighted understanding dawn. "Clara." "I am with child," Clara confirmed, laughing at her sister's expression. "Due in the spring. Mr. Fairweather has hardly stopped smiling since the physician confirmed it, though I suspect he will drive himself to exhaustion fussing over me before the year is through." The two sisters embraced again, longer this time, and Margaret felt the particular warmth of a joy made sweeter for being shared, the same warmth she remembered from the day her own daughter had been born, when Clara had been the first person outside the immediate family to hold the child, weeping openly and without embarrassment at the sight of her. They spent the afternoon in the garden, the two sisters seated together beneath the shade of an old oak tree not unlike the one that had witnessed so many quiet, difficult conversations during that long-ago summer, while Margaret's daughter and Alaric played some elaborate game involving the small dog, and a great many rules that seemed to change with each round. "Do you ever think of it?" Clara asked, watching their husbands who had fallen into easy conversation nearby. "That dinner, all those years ago? It feels almost like a story that happened to someone else entirely." "Sometimes," Margaret admitted, "usually when I catch myself being too cautious about something, holding my tongue when I ought to speak plainly. I remember how close I came to losing everything through simple silence, and it reminds me not to make that mistake again." "You have certainly learned that lesson well," Clara said, with a teasing smile. "I do not believe I have heard you hold your tongue about anything in the past 3 years." "A gross exaggeration," Margaret said, laughing, "though perhaps not entirely without merit." They spoke, too, of Nathaniel, who had married the following year after Margaret's own wedding, a quiet, cheerful woman from a neighboring county who had, by every account, made him entirely happy. He and Margaret remained close friends still, their families visiting often enough that the old awkwardness of unspoken feelings had long since faded into something comfortable and easy, a friendship that had, in the end, proven exactly as steady and enduring as Nathaniel himself had always been. "He asked after you, the last time I saw him," Clara mentioned, "whether you were well, whether the child was thriving. He always asks, every time, without fail." "He has always been a good friend," Margaret said simply, and meant it entirely, without the complicated ache such words might once have carried. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Baron Ashworth arrived as well, now considerably grayer than he had been 3 years before but no less content, delighting immediately in his granddaughter's enthusiastic greeting, and settling into a garden chair with the particular satisfaction of a man surrounded by a family that had, against considerable odds, found its way to lasting happiness. Lady Beaumont followed shortly after, as she rarely missed an opportunity to visit either of her nieces, and she arrived already speaking of the coming grandchild with the same enthusiastic planning she had once devoted to Clara's wedding breakfast, much to the amusement of everyone present. "I always knew it would end well," Lady Beaumont declared, settling into the seat beside Baron Ashworth with a satisfied air. "I told you both so, did I not, from the very beginning?" "You told us a great many things, Aunt," Clara said, exchanging an amused glance with Margaret, not all of which proved entirely accurate at the time. "Details," Lady Beaumont said, waving a dismissive hand. "The important thing is that everyone has ended precisely where they ought to be." Margaret, watching her family gathered together in the golden light of a late summer evening, her daughter's laughter carrying across the garden, her sister glowing with news of a coming child, her husband speaking warmly with her father nearby, found she could not entirely disagree with her aunt's assessment, however imprecise the path had been in arriving here. It had not been an easy road. There had been months of silence and guilt, a sister's hurt that had taken real time and real honesty to properly heal, a friendship that had asked for patience it had never once demanded openly, and a love that had needed to be examined honestly before it could be trusted at all. But standing here now, 3 years removed from that fateful dinner and the shattered wineglass that had first set everything into motion, Margaret understood something she had not fully grasped as a younger woman, quietly managing everyone else's happiness while denying her own existence entirely. Some truths, however painful in their arrival, were worth the difficult work of finally speaking them aloud. As dusk settled fully over the garden and the family began gathering themselves for the walk back toward the house, lanterns being lit along the path by quiet, efficient servants, Margaret felt Alaric's hand find hers once more, warm and familiar, and she looked up at him with the same steady certainty that had carried her through every difficult turn of the past several years. "Happy?" he asked quietly, as they walked together behind the rest of the family, their daughter running ahead toward the lit windows of the house. "Entirely," Margaret said, and found, as she had found every day since that long-ago autumn evening at the dinner table, that the word had never once felt truer. Behind them, the old house stood warm and welcoming against the darkening sky, its windows glowing gold with lamplight, no longer a place of careful silences and buried feelings, but simply, finally, a home. Inside, the family gathered around the long dining table where, 3 years before, a careless announcement had first upended everything Margaret believed about her own place within the household. The table looked much the same as it had that evening, the same polished wood, the same tall candles casting warm light across familiar faces, but the atmosphere it now held could not have been more different. Where once there had been tension thick enough to silence an entire room, there was now only easy laughter, the clatter of dishes being passed, and the happy, overlapping chatter of a family entirely comfortable in one another's company. "Tell the story again," Margaret's daughter demanded, climbing into her father's lap once the meal had properly begun, her small face bright with the particular insistence of a child who has heard a favorite tale many times before and wishes to hear it once more regardless. "Which story is that?" Alaric asked, though the knowing smile he exchanged with Margaret suggested he knew perfectly well which one his daughter meant. "The one about the broken glass," the child said. "Aunt Clara says it is the most exciting dinner that ever happened in this whole house." Clara laughed from across the table. "It certainly felt that way at the time," she said, catching Margaret's eye with a warm, knowing look that carried none of the old hurt, only the comfortable fondness of a story both sisters had long since made peace with. "Your father said something very foolish that evening, and it took the whole family the better part of a year to sort out the consequences of it." "Foolish, but ultimately fortunate," Alaric said, unbothered by his daughter's amused audience. "Sometimes a man must say the wrong thing entirely before he can find his way to the right one." "I do not think that is a lesson you ought to be teaching her," Margaret said, though she was laughing too, unable to hold back her own amusement at the familiar telling of a story that had once caused her so much private anguish, and now, with the safe distance of years, felt more like a cherished family legend than a painful memory. Baron Ashworth, seated at the head of the table as he always insisted upon despite his daughter's occasional teasing about his old-fashioned formality, watched the exchange with evident contentment. "I confess," he said, "I did not know what to make of any of it, that first evening. A duke announcing himself over dinner, my daughters exchanging glances I could not properly interpret, your aunt already planning a wedding that had not yet been agreed upon by anyone involved." "I was simply being prepared," Lady Beaumont said primly, though the twinkle in her eye suggested she took no real offense at the gentle teasing. "Someone in this family has always needed to think several steps ahead, and it has rarely been either of you." The evening continued in this easy fashion, stories exchanged and retold with the particular warmth that only comes from a family who has weathered genuine difficulty together and found their way, eventually, to lasting happiness on the other side of it. Nathaniel and his wife arrived partway through the evening, having been delayed by matters on their own estate, and their arrival was greeted with the same warmth extended to every member of the wider family circle that had grown up around Margaret and Alaric's marriage, each person a thread in a tapestry that had once seemed at risk of unraveling entirely. Later, once the younger members of the family had been put to bed and the older guests had settled into quieter conversation over tea in the drawing room, Margaret found a moment to stand alone on the terrace, looking out over the darkened garden where her daughter had spent the afternoon playing. The night air was cool and fragrant with the last of the summer roses, and she thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of the frightened, uncertain woman she had been 3 years before, carrying a secret she believed would cost her everything, if it were ever spoken aloud. She had been wrong, she understood now, standing here in the peaceful dark with the sound of her family's laughter drifting faintly from the drawing room behind her. The secret had cost her something, certainly. Months of guilt and a friendship strained nearly to breaking before it healed into something stronger. But the silence, had she maintained it forever, would have cost her far more. It would have cost her the chance at exactly the life she now stood within. A husband who had learned to love her honestly, rather than carelessly. A sister whose bond with her had grown deeper for having survived real difficulty. A daughter who would grow up in a house built on truth, rather than careful, exhausting performance. Alaric found her there a short while later, slipping an arm around her waist and following her gaze out toward the dark garden. "You are thinking of that dinner again," he said, not quite a question. "I am thinking of how differently things might have ended," Margaret admitted, "had I continued saying nothing at all." "But you did not," Alaric said gently. "In the end, when it mattered most, you found the courage to speak the truth, even when it frightened you. That has always been the part of the story I admire most, more than anything I said that evening, careless as it was." Margaret leaned into him, watching the last of the candlelight flicker in the windows behind them, and felt, as she had felt every day since that difficult transformative year, an abiding gratitude for the strange, winding path that had led her here, to this quiet terrace, this warm and honest home, this family that had learned, through real hardship, exactly how much better honesty served them than any amount of careful, well-meaning silence ever could. "Come inside," she said finally, taking his hand. "Clara will want to tell the story of the broken glass at least once more before the evening ends, and I find I do not mind hearing it again." They returned together to the warm, glowing house, leaving the quiet garden behind them, and the story that had once begun with a shattered wine glass and a secret kept too long finally settled, at last, into exactly what it had always been meant to become, not a scandal to be whispered about, but simply the beginning of a family's long and hard-won happiness.